Welcome to Module 7, Communicating Analytical Insights for Decision Making. In this module, we move from the work of producing analysis to the equally important work of making that analysis usable. A model, a statistical result, or a carefully built dashboard does not create value simply because it exists. It creates value when someone can understand what it means, evaluate its relevance, and use it to make a better decision. That is why communication is not an accessory to analytics. It is part of the analytical process itself, because the final step of analysis is helping another person see what the evidence is saying and what choices the evidence supports. Throughout this module, I want you to pay close attention to the relationship between insight and action. Analytical insights often begin as patterns in data, such as a trend, a relationship, an outlier, or a difference between expected and observed results. But decision makers usually do not act on raw patterns. They act on meaning. And that meaning has to be communicated in a way that is accurate, clear, and connected to the decision problem in front of them. When communication fails, even strong analysis can be ignored, misread, or applied in the wrong way, which means the quality of the decision may suffer even though the technical work was sound. This is especially important in data-driven decision making, because decision makers often face limits of time, attention, and technical background. They may not have the opportunity to review every assumption, every calculation, or every methodological detail behind an analysis. Instead, they rely on summaries, visualizations, presentations, and recommendations to understand what matters. That places a serious responsibility on the analyst or analytical communicator. The goal is not to oversimplify the work or hide uncertainty, but to translate complexity into a form that supports thoughtful judgment. As we work through this module, we will focus on how communication shapes interpretation. The way findings are organized can guide attention toward the most important evidence, while poor organization can make meaningful results seem confusing or less credible. The same is true for visual communication. Charts, graphs, and dashboards can make analytical findings easier to understand, but only when they are interpreted carefully and designed with the decision maker in mind. A visual can clarify a pattern, but it can also distort understanding if the audience does not know what the axes represent, what comparison is being made, or what conclusion is reasonable from the evidence shown. We will also examine how insights become recommendations. In graduate level analytics, it is not enough to say that the data shows an increase, a decrease, a correlation, or a projected outcome. A professional analytical presentation must help the audience understand what those findings imply for action. That does not mean making unsupported claims or pretending the analysis provides certainty where it does not. It means connecting the evidence to a decision context, explaining the logic behind the recommendation, and making clear what trade-offs, risks, or limitations should be considered before action is taken. Another important theme in this module is effectiveness. An analytical presentation is effective when it helps decision makers understand the evidence accurately and use it appropriately. That effectiveness depends on more than attractive slides or polished language. It depends on whether the presentation is clear, whether it is faithful to the analysis, whether it highlights the most relevant information, and whether it avoids creating confusion or incorrect conclusions. In that sense, communication quality and analysis quality are connected. A poorly communicated analysis can damage the value of good evidence, while clear communication can make complex evidence accessible without weakening its integrity. So, as we begin Module 7, I want you to approach communication as a core analytical skill. The question is not simply whether the numbers are correct. although accuracy remains essential. The deeper question is whether the findings are presented in a way that allows decision makers to understand the situation, evaluate the evidence, and choose a reasonable course of action. This perspective also reminds us that communication is not about decorating the results after the real work is finished. It is about preserving the meaning of the analysis as it travels from the analyst to the decision maker, so the final message remains accurate, useful, and responsible. That is the practical purpose of communicating analytical insights for decision making. By the end of this module, you should be better prepared to move from analysis to explanation, from explanation to recommendation, and from recommendation to informed decision making. Here we begin with the importance of communication in data-driven decision making. It is easy to assume that the hardest part of analytics is producing the correct result, but in practice, the result only matters if it can be understood and used. A decision maker may not see the raw data, the full model, or every assumption behind the analysis. What they usually receive is a summary, a visualization, or a presentation that is supposed to help them understand what the analysis means. Because of that, communication becomes the bridge between technical work and practical decision making. Clear communication ensures that analytical results are not simply delivered, but actually understood. When results are explained carefully, the audience can see what question was analyzed, what evidence was used, and what the findings suggest. This matters because data does not speak for itself in a business or organizational context. Data must be interpreted through a decision problem, and that interpretation has to be communicated in a way that is accurate without becoming unnecessarily complicated. The goal is not to reduce the analysis to something shallow, but to make the reasoning visible enough that the audience can trust it and apply it appropriately. Decision makers often rely on summaries because they need the essential meaning of complex findings without reviewing every technical detail. A good summary does more than shorten the analysis. It organizes the findings around what matters for the decision. It helps the audience understand which results are central, which are supporting, and which limitations should be kept in mind. If the summary is vague, too technical, or disconnected from the decision context, then the decision maker may miss the most important implication. In that situation, the analysis may be accurate, but its usefulness is weakened by the way it is communicated. Visualizations also play a major role because they can make complex findings easier to interpret. A chart can show a trend more quickly than a paragraph, and a graph can make a relationship more visible than a table of numbers. However, visuals still require explanation because audiences need to understand what is being compared, what the scale means, and what conclusion can reasonably be drawn. A poorly explained visualization can create confidence in the wrong interpretation. That is why visual communication has to be treated as part of the analytical message, not merely as decoration added to a report. Presentations add another layer because they require the analyst to guide the audience through the logic of the findings. In a presentation, the order of ideas matters. The speaker has to decide what context the audience needs first, how much detail to include, and how to connect the findings to the decision at hand. If the presentation jumps from numbers to conclusions too quickly, the audience may not understand the reasoning. If it includes too much detail without structure, the audience may become lost before the main insight is reached. One of the central points here is that accurate analysis can still lead to misunderstanding or poor decisions if the insight is not communicated clearly. Accuracy is necessary, but it is not sufficient. A finding can be statistically correct and still be misused if the audience does not understand the assumptions, scope, or meaning of the result. For example, a projected increase in demand may sound positive, but the recommendation depends on whether the organization has enough capacity, whether the projection is uncertain, and whether the increase is large enough to justify action. Without clear communication, the audience may react to the number without understanding the conditions around it. Effective data-driven decision-making therefore depends on two forms of quality working together. The first is analysis quality, which involves sound data, appropriate methods, careful interpretation, and honest treatment of uncertainty. The second is communication quality, which involves clarity, organization, relevance, and an ability to explain findings in a way that supports judgment. If either side is weak, the decision process becomes weaker. Strong analysis with poor communication may not influence action, while polished communication with weak analysis can create a misleading sense of confidence. As you move through this module, I want you to treat communication as a professional responsibility. When people make decisions based on analytical work, they are relying on the analyst to preserve the meaning of the evidence. That means being clear about what the analysis shows, what it doesn't show, and how the findings should be used. It also means recognizing that communication shapes interpretation, and interpretation shapes action. In data-driven decision-making, the value of analysis is realized only when the insight is communicated well enough to support a better decision. Now we turn to the interpretation of visual representations of data used in analytical reports. In many analytical settings, visuals are the first place decision makers look because they can compress a great deal of information into a form that is easier to scan and compare. Charts, graphs, and dashboards can reveal patterns that might be difficult to notice in a spreadsheet or a long written report. At the same time, a visual is not automatically clear simply because it is visual. It still has to be read carefully, with attention to what is being measured, how the information is organized, and what conclusion the evidence actually supports. When we talk about charts and graphs, we are talking about tools that translate numerical or categorical information into visual form. A line chart may help show change over time. A bar chart may help compare categories, and a scatter plot may help reveal a relationship between two variables. These formats can be powerful because they allow the audience to see structure in the data rather than process each number separately. But the value of the chart depends on correct interpretation. If someone misunderstands the scale, the comparison group, or the unit of measurement, the visual may lead to a conclusion that the underlying data does not justify. Dashboards add another level of complexity because they often combine multiple visuals into one decision support interface. A dashboard may show performance indicators, trends, comparisons, and alerts in the same space, which can be useful when decision makers need to monitor several aspects of a situation at once. However, dashboards can also create confusion if the audience does not know which metric is most important, how the metrics relate to one another, or whether a change is meaningful. In a strong analytical report, a dashboard should help people focus attention, not overwhelm them with disconnected indicators. The slide emphasizes that visual representations help communicate analytical findings in reports, and this is an important point. A report may contain detailed analysis, but the visual often becomes the part that anchors the reader's understanding. A well-designed visual can make an analytical finding easier to explain because it gives the audience something concrete to examine. Instead of only saying that revenue increased, response time decreased, or risk varied across groups, the visual can show the size and direction of that change. In that way, visuals support communication by making findings more visible and easier to discuss. Correct interpretation is critical because visuals often influence judgment quickly. People tend to form impressions from a chart before they read all of the surrounding explanation. That means the analyst has to make sure the visual is accurate, properly labeled, and aligned with the message of the report. If the axis is misleading, if categories are unclear, or if the visual highlights the wrong comparison, the audience may walk away with an incorrect understanding. This is why visual interpretation is not only a technical skill, it is also a communication skill. Patterns are one of the main things we look for in analytical visuals. A pattern may show that certain outcomes occur more frequently under specific conditions, or that performance differs across departments, regions, customer groups, or time periods. But recognizing a pattern is only the beginning. The next step is to ask whether the pattern is meaningful, whether it is consistent, and whether it should influence the decision being considered. A visual can point us toward a possible insight, but the analyst still has to connect that pattern to evidence and context. Trends and relationships require the same careful attention. A trend can suggest improvement, decline, stability, volatility, or seasonality, but not every movement in a line or bar represents a meaningful change. Some changes may reflect normal variation, temporary conditions, or data collection issues. In the same way, a visual may show that two variables move together, but that does not automatically mean that one causes the other. Visuals help us see possible relationships, while interpretation determines whether those relationships are understood responsibly. So, as you interpret visual representations in analytical reports, I want you to move beyond simply noticing what the chart looks like. Ask what the visual is designed to communicate, what data it is based on, what comparisons it invites, and what limitations should be considered. The purpose of a visual is not only to make a report more attractive, it is to support clearer understanding of analytical findings. When charts, graphs, and dashboards are interpreted correctly, they help decision makers see patterns, trends, and relationships in a way that supports better judgment. When they are interpreted carelessly, they can produce confidence in the wrong conclusion. Now we move into the question of how analytical insights can be translated into recommendations. This is where analysis becomes especially valuable for decision making, because decision makers need more than a description of what the data shows. They need guidance about what the organization should consider doing next, why that action makes sense, and how strongly the evidence supports it. An analytical insight may reveal a problem, an opportunity, a trend, or a risk. But the recommendation connects that insight to a possible course of action. Without that connection, the analysis may be interesting, but it may not be useful. When we say that decision makers need more than data, we are recognizing that data by itself does not tell an organization what to do. A table may show declining performance, a forecast may show rising demand, or a model may identify a high-risk segment, but someone still has to interpret what that finding means in context. The decision maker wants to know whether the result is significant enough to act on, whether action is urgent, and what options are available. This is why analytical communication must move from evidence to meaning, and then from meaning to action. The recommendation should not appear suddenly at the end. It should grow logically from the analysis that came before it. A meaningful recommendation begins with a clear understanding of the decision problem. The analyst has to know what decisions being considered, what constraints exist, and what outcomes matter to the organization. For example, a recommendation about increasing staffing, adjusting inventory, changing a process, or reallocating resources depends on the goals and limitations surrounding that decision. The same analytical finding may lead to different recommendations in different contexts because organizations have different budgets, risks, timelines, and priorities. That is why recommendations should be grounded not only in the data, but also in the practical situation the decision maker faces. Translating insights into recommendations also requires judgment about relevance. Not every finding deserves the same amount of attention, and not every pattern should become a recommendation. Some findings may be statistically noticeable, but operationally minor, while others may have a direct effect on cost, performance, risk, or customer outcomes. The communicator has to decide which insights are most important for the decision and explain why those insights matter. This helps the audience avoid getting distracted by details that do not substantially affect the action being considered. At the same time, recommendations must remain faithful to the analysis. A recommendation should not claim more certainty than the evidence provides, and it should not ignore limitations just because a strong conclusion sounds more persuasive. If the analysis is based on assumptions or incomplete data, the recommendation should acknowledge those conditions in a professional way. That does not weaken the recommendation. It makes the recommendation more responsible. Decision makers can act more intelligently when they understand both the evidence supporting an action and the risks surrounding it. A strong recommendation usually explains the reasoning behind the proposed action. It does not simply say, "Do this," and expect the audience to accept it. It shows how the insight leads to the action, what benefit the action is expected to produce, and what trade-offs may need to be managed. This reasoning is important because decision makers are often comparing multiple possible paths, each with its own costs and consequences. When the logic is clear, the recommendation becomes easier to evaluate, question, refine, and implement. This is where the distinction between an insight and a recommendation becomes important. An insight explains what the analysis suggests about the situation, while a recommendation explains what should be done in response to that insight. For example, an insight might show that customer wait times are highest during a specific period, while a recommendation might suggest adjusting staff schedules during that period. The insight gives the reason, the recommendation gives the direction. In effective analytical communication, the audience should be able to see that connection without having to guess. As we analyze how insights become recommendations, I want you to focus on disciplined reasoning. The goal is not to turn every data point into advice, and it is not to make recommendations sound stronger than they are. The goal is to help decision makers move from understanding the evidence to choosing an informed course of action. That requires clarity, restraint, context, and a careful explanation of how the analysis supports the recommendation. When this is done well, analytical communication becomes more than reporting results. It becomes a structured process for supporting better decisions. Now we close this module by evaluating the effectiveness of analytical presentations for decision makers. This slide brings together the communication issue we have been developing. The way information is presented can influence how it is interpreted. In analytics, presentation is not only about appearance or style, it is about whether the audience can understand the evidence accurately enough to use it. A decision maker may be looking at the same data as the analyst, but if the information is arranged poorly, labeled unclearly, or explained without context, the interpretation can shift in a direction the analysis does not support. That is why effectiveness has to be judged by how well the presentation supports understanding and decision making. The first idea here is that presentation shapes interpretation. When a finding is placed at the beginning of a presentation, emphasized visually, or repeated in the speaker's explanation, the audience naturally treats it as important. When a finding is buried in a crowded slide or surrounded by unrelated details, the audience may overlook it, even if it is highly relevant. A strong presentation guides attention toward the evidence, that matters most for the decision, while still being transparent about supporting details and limitations. Poorly designed presentations can create confusion, and the confusion can lead to incorrect conclusions. This may happen when a slide contains too much information, when charts are not labeled clearly, when the visual design makes comparisons difficult, or when the spoken explanation does not connect the evidence to the decision problem. The problem is not always that the data is wrong. Sometimes the data is valid, but the presentation makes it hard for the audience to understand what the numbers mean. In that situation, the failure is a communication failure, and it can be just as damaging as a technical error because it affects the final decision. An effective analytical presentation should be clear. Clarity means that the audience can follow the structure of the argument without having to struggle through unnecessary complexity. It means the presentation identifies the question being addressed, explains the evidence being used, and connects the findings in a logical sequence. Clear communication does not mean removing all detail or treating the audience as if they cannot understand complexity. It means organizing detail so that complexity becomes manageable and the decision maker can see how the analysis relates to possible action. Accuracy is equally important because a presentation can be clear and still be misleading if it simplifies the evidence too much. In analytical communication, accuracy includes using correct numbers, representing charts honestly, stating uncertainty appropriately, and avoiding conclusions that go beyond what the analysis can support. A decision maker may prefer a simple answer, but responsible communication sometimes requires explaining that the evidence is conditional, incomplete, or sensitive to assumptions. That kind of accuracy protects the integrity of the decision process by keeping the finding and its limits visible. Usefulness is the third part of effective analytical presentation. A presentation is useful when it helps the decision maker compare alternatives, understand a risk, identify a priority, or choose a course of action. Usefulness requires alignment with the audience's needs because a technical explanation may be useful for analysts reviewing methodology, while a high-level summary may be better for executives deciding whether to approve a strategy. At the same time, a broad summary may not be enough for a team responsible for implementation. The communicator has to understand what decision the audience is facing and shape the presentation around that decision. Evaluating effectiveness therefore requires us to ask more than whether the slides look professional. We need to ask whether the presentation reduces misunderstanding, supports accurate interpretation, and helps decision makers connect evidence to action. If the slides are attractive, but the audience leaves unsure about what the analysis means, the presentation has not fully succeeded. Effective analytical presentations should be clear, accurate, and useful because those qualities protect the decision process itself. As you think about your own analytical presentations, remember that the final product is not simply a set of slides. It is a communication experience designed to move the audience from a decision problem through evidence toward a recent judgment. The best presentations present the right information in the right order with enough explanation to support accurate interpretation. In data-driven decision making, this is what makes analytical communication effective. It helps people understand what the evidence means and use that understanding to make better, more responsible decisions.